This is Julie Jensen. She's with her two sons, David, the older boy, and Douglas, the little boy. As you are aware by now, in this case, Mark Jensen, the defendant, stands accused of murdering his wife, Julie Jensen, in 1998 by poisoning her with ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in antifreeze. Now, when you have a murder case such as this, you hear evidence in great detail about the person who is killed. So you're going to hear evidence about how Julie's body was discovered dead in her bed at her home. You'll hear detailed evidence about things like how her arm was positioned, the lividity of the blood in her body, how her face looked buried in the pillow. You're going to hear about Julie's blood and what was in it, her stomach contents and her kidneys, and how they revealed the evidence of the ethylene glycol poisoning. And there's two things that you're going to hear in the evidence that you should know about ethylene glycol poisoning. A person should not have ethylene glycol in their system. The human body is made up of all sorts of things, but ethylene glycol is not one of them. So if ethylene glycol is found in a person, that is instant evidence of poisoning. And it has happened that some people have accidentally killed themselves with ethylene glycol, and some people have purposefully committed suicide by drinking ethylene glycol. But in this case, the evidence you're going to hear is that the defendant murdered his wife with ethylene glycol, that this was not Julie Jensen ingesting that substance to commit suicide. And that leads me to the other thing you should know about ethylene glycol. It's a drug that is not commonly tested for at autopsy. At autopsies, there are tests that are done for drugs, like prescription drugs or illegal street drugs. But ethylene glycol, such an unusual substance, is not typically tested for. And so a person doing an autopsy isn't necessarily going to find it unless they're looking for it. So you're going to hear that evidence about the ethylene glycol in Julie Jensen's blood and in her stomach, and other evidence of that poisoning in her system. You may even see some photos from the autopsy showing evidence from the inside of her body. So in this trial, you're going to hear Julie Jensen talked about in that way, that detached, impersonal evidence. But this is Julie Jensen. And in this murder case, even more important than how her body was found and what was in her blood and her stomach, even more important than that is the evidence you will hear about Julie the person. You are going to hear from witness after witness, people who knew Julie in various aspects of her life, that her family and her children were everything to her. She even had a specialized license plate on her car, My 3Ds, that stood for her two children, David and Douglas, and the father of her children, the third D, Daddy, that was for Mark Jensen. When Julie Jensen died, her oldest son, David, he was 8 years old. He was in third grade at Southport Elementary School. And you are going to hear from David's third grade teacher. Her name is Therese DeFazio. And she's a witness in this case because Julie Jensen was very involved in her son's life. She was actually a room mother in this third grade class. And so even though her youngest child, Douglas, he was only 3 years old, and she was a stay-at-home mom, it doesn't mean that she just stayed at home. Every Wednesday morning, starting in the beginning of that school year in 1998, Julie would volunteer in David's classroom to help out Ms. DeFazio. She would help the other students in the class and help Ms. DeFazio with various projects. And one thing that Julie Jensen and Ms. DeFazio had in common that you'll hear about in the evidence is that Ms. DeFazio had 2 sons too, 2 older sons. And so that was a topic of conversation between them because Julie Jensen was asking her for advice. What do you do with 2 sons? How do you raise your sons? She was looking towards the future, thinking about college for David, a very bright child. And Julie Jensen was also a big part of her children's activities. She was the kind of mom who would make Halloween costumes for her kids by hand. She was good at crafts and sewing, and she was a good baker. And you're going to hear in this case a lot about the neighborhood. The Jensens lived in Pleasant Prairie in a neighborhood known as Carroll Beach, which is near the lake. They had a nice yard with a beautiful garden, a swimming pool, and you'll hear from the neighbors who often saw Julie playing in the yard with the children or neighborhood children coming over to the house because they had the swimming pool. But Julie Jensen also had a life outside her children. Before her oldest son was born, she worked as an assistant at a stock brokerage firm. And even when she was a stay-at-home mom, she wasn't an isolated person. She was outgoing. She went out of her way to meet and get to know her neighbors. She made her neighbors her friends. And you're going to hear from a variety of neighbors who say that about Julie Jensen. She was also active in a neighborhood book club. You're going to hear about the book club. The month before Julie Jensen died, in November of 1998, she hosted the book club and she invited the ladies in the book club into her home. Finally, she was an avid gardener. Gardening was really her passion, so she would be outside a lot working on the garden. In the week of her death, she called a neighbor just to discuss gardening, some seeds that the neighbor had or had grown. Julie Jensen was looking to purchase that in the future and was asking questions about it of her neighbor. The only real problem for Julie Jensen in the fall of 1998 was with her marriage. But before we talk about that time, the fall of 1998, I want to go back to 1990 and to 1991 in the months after David, her oldest, was born. Now, that's a big transition time in a marriage, the time before kids and the time after kids. And it caused some issues in the Jensen marriage. Julie felt that the defendant was not involved enough with David, not supportive enough. And she had returned to work part-time after David's birth, and that was a difficult transition too. And Julie Jensen during that time was suffering from some postpartum depression. And she went to a psychotherapist. She saw the psychotherapist for about a year. She was prescribed an antidepressant. And the defendant also went to this psychotherapist several times too, because the therapist felt it was useful to see both the Jensens, and these sessions lasted about a year. So in this trial, if you hear about Julie Jensen's history of depression, that this is a suicide because she had a history of depression, well, that's it. The postpartum depression and seasonal affective disorder when the seasons change, like fall, that she was treated for 1 year in 1990 to 1991. Julie Jensen did not have a history of suicide attempts. She did not have suicidal ideation. She had no suicide plans. And what a therapist is supposed to do, what you'll hear in the evidence, is ask someone, if they have signs of depression, to ask that person about risk of suicide. At no time did Julie Jensen ever say she was contemplating suicide. And in fact, she would cite her children. She could never do it because of her kids. And that's what happened in 1990 and 1991. And really what you're going to hear is the problem during that time period was with the Jensen marriage. In addition to Julie Jensen's concerns about the defendant's lack of involvement with David, she just felt the defendant didn't love her anymore. and she even contemplated divorce during that time period. Julie Jensen began confiding in a coworker, a man named Perry Tarica. He was going through a divorce, and he also had a young child. And one weekend, Julie made the mistake of inviting Perry Tarica to her home on a weekend when her husband was gone. And that weekend, she had sex, she had a fling with Perry Tarica. So she cheated on her husband. Now, that's the only time Julie Jensen and Perry Tarica were intimate. And you can tell from the evidence that Julie Jensen immediately regretted this. She cut off the relationship with this man immediately. And she even left her employment where they had worked together. And after that, Julie Jensen decided to not keep secrets from her husband again. And in this trial, I expect you'll hear from Perry Tarica as a witness. I expect you'll hear about this relationship he and Julie Jensen had as co-workers at first, and then confiding in each other about their more personal issues. And you'll hear about during that time period, as Julie was contemplating divorce, she even went with Mr. Tarica to his divorce lawyer. And in fact, in June of 1991, Julie Jensen did file for divorce, though obviously that didn't go through. The reason I am going back to 1990 and 1991 is because that changed everything in the Jensen marriage. You will hear in the evidence that the defendant never forgave Julie Jensen for that affair. And by the way, there's no obligation to forgive a spouse for an affair. That's not required. Sometimes affairs break relationships, they break marriages. When that happens, divorce is always an option. Forgiveness is not required. But Mark Jensen did not file for divorce. Instead, he engaged in a campaign of covert harassment directed at his wife to degrade her and gratify him. In a case that is full of strange facts, this harassment over the course of years is perhaps the strangest. And here's how it would look. From time to time, starting after Julie's affair, someone would apparently be leaving pornographic images outside of the Jensen home, on the deck, in the shed, even, allegedly, mailing these pornographic images to the defendant's place of work and leaving them on his car at work. And so what were these images? Well, almost all of them appeared to be printed out computer photos, so in black and white, on regular paper. Only once was it an actual photograph that was left. And these photos were pornographic. They would show sexual activity. Sometimes sexual intercourse, sometimes oral sex, sometimes a woman positioned as though she was about to perform oral sex on a man, and sometimes just naked photos of men with erect penises. Another feature of this harassment was phone calls. Far more than the occasional hang-up call that people got in the 1990s, over and over and over again, call after call of hang-ups. And a lot of this was directed towards Mark, he said, that he would get these harassing calls at work, that he would receive these harassing photos at work. And so over and over and over again, Julie Jensen reported this activity to the Pleasant Prairie Police Department, beginning in 1991 after that affair, and all the way through the beginning of 1998, this continued. An extremely long length of time, almost 7 years. And this happened so frequently, and Julie Jensen reported it to the police, that she actually asked to just speak to one officer, so she wouldn't have to say the whole story over and over again. And that officer ended up being Officer Ron Cosman. And so how it would work is most of the images were purportedly found by the defendant. That's what Julie told the police. The defendant would come to her and present her with the images he had found at work or at home. And as the Jensens reported it to the police, they believed the culprit was Perry Tarica, because it seemed as though the images were chosen to resemble Julie. And the frightening idea was presented that this man, Perry Tarica, had secretly taken pictures of him and Julie when they had sex that long time ago. That he had had this fling with Julie, and now he was rubbing it in her face to humiliate her for years. And the police tried to investigate this. The police suggested to Julie that she keep a log of this activity. And you're going to see that she did. She kept a handwritten log. And it's actually stunning to see because it's so long. There's just page after page of this harassing activity. Because the defendant had said that these images were frequently left at his vehicle at work, the Pleasant Prairie Police Department suggested that the Jensens hire a private investigator. Maybe that person can stake out the car and see if they catch anybody. Or they suggested placing a video camera, videotape the car, and see if anyone leaves anything. But these efforts didn't work. The defendant was aware of this private investigator, and so while that private investigator was involved, nothing happened. The police also suggested putting a trace on the phone through the phone company. Remember, we're talking about the 90s, and so no caller ID. But when these traces were put on, the calls would stop. So the anonymous perpetrator could not be found that way. And so Officer Ron Cosman, he had a lot of contacts with Julie about this because of the harassment. And he was thinking about these traces. And he was thinking, well, how could these phone calls stop when we try to put these traces on? How could the perpetrator know to stop these calls? The only people who know about these traces are the Jensens and me, the police officer. And so Ron Cosman specifically asked Julie, for the last trace that was done, he asked her not to tell the defendant. And so when the last trace is put on, and Officer Ron Cosman is checking in on that, and so he goes to Julie's house and he asks her if the calls had continued, and she said no. But Julie wasn't looking him in the eye. And so he asked her, did you tell the defendant this trace was going on? And she admitted that she had. And at that moment, Ron Cosman was frustrated with her. He said, why'd you do that? And so Julie explained, remember, in her mind, this harassment is her fault. It's because of that affair. This degradation, what her husband is going through, what she's going through, it's her fault. And she said, well, after that affair, she just didn't want to keep things from the defendant. Didn't feel right not to tell him, so she told him. And it's true that the man that Julie Jensen had this affair with, he was a suspect too. But the thing is, he had never even lived in Wisconsin, and then even living in Illinois, he ended up moving away, far away, like you'd have to fly a plane. He ended up moving far away early on. And this harassment, again, went on for like 7 years. And so it just didn't make sense. He's coming back to Wisconsin to leave these pictures around the Jensen home. It's not even a drive away. To leave these pictures at Mark Jensen's place of work, it just doesn't make sense. So you're going to see in the evidence this log that Julie kept of this harassment. And Julie Jensen ended up dying. She died on December 3rd of 1998. But this virtually constant harassment that had been going on since 1991, it slows down after June of 1998, and then it comes to a total stop after August of 1998. And you're going to hear in the evidence in this period of time that that's when the defendant gets a girlfriend. That's when his affair starts. Now, you're also going to hear about computer evidence. And most of the computer evidence relates to the murder itself, but some of it relates to this harassment. And one thing you'll hear is that the defendant, on his work computer, which was seized by the police, this is a 2002 computer. So years after the harassment, but it's still relevant for this reason. On this 2002 work computer, the defendant had an extensive collection of pornographic images.
Judge, I object at this point, and I'd ask for a sidebar.
Why don't you guys go on back for a second? We're going to just take care of it right away.
To images of pornography, unless they can somehow be connected to the images that were given, that were dropped around the house or around the work, I'm not sure how that's relevant. It's years after Julie Jensen's death, and unless there's a direct connection, a computer he had after her death, I don't know how that's relevant or those images would be relevant.
Your Honor, I'll just say this. I think it's outrageous that Ms. McNeil's opening statement was interrupted by this. Defense counsel has known for years that this evidence had been admitted at the last trial. If it was defense counsel's intention to bring a motion to exclude this evidence, that motion should have been heard by this court. We had numerous pretrial motions. There's never been any question that this evidence was going to be admitted during the course of this trial. And this evidence is clearly critically relevant to the evidence the state is going to be presenting during the course of this case. These 2,200 penis photos that were on the defendant's computer demonstrate a number of things. It demonstrates his odd preoccupation with the male member. It demonstrates that his level of offense that he took, that his wife, Julie, had this affair with this Perry Tariqa, in which she had apparently performed fellatio upon Perry Tariqa, but it was something that she wouldn't do with him. These Venus photos that were left around the house for years and years and years, according to the investigating officers, including a Detective Ellis, who was a private detective in this matter, reflected that somebody had an enormous array of pornography that they could tap in order to find penis photos that included a person that kind of looked like Julie, and included a background that where they could not exclude her bedroom as being the place where these photos were taken. There was ample testimony about this at the last trial. The relevance of the other act's evidence has already been ruled upon by the Wisconsin Court of Appeals, and it's the law of the case in this matter. So to interrupt this opening statement on this basis is outrageous, and the objection should be overruled, and we should continue with this opening statement.
I'll let you respond briefly.
Thank you, Judge. I have to object when I think there's irrelevant, inadmissible evidence being presented, and I'm going to continue to do that during witnesses, even if they testified about it last time, because this court decides what's relevant in this case. Unless they can connect these 2002 penis pictures to the evidence prior to 1998, I don't understand how it's relevant. If the pictures that the Jensens were receiving were of someone giving fellatio, and these are just penis pictures, again, I'm not sure how it's relevant to the death of Julie Jensen.
All right. What I'm going to say is the last statement by Ms. Krause would be a great statement at a closing argument, because we would have had all the evidence come in, and if the defense had made a motion on relevance and I had overruled it, the defense could argue, well, even though it came in, we don't think it's relevant. We're at opening statements. I don't see, mean, this is not my first rodeo. I don't see a lot of objections at opening statements. And a lot of times, statements are made and then they come back to haunt the other party because that evidence was never presented, it never came in. So I just read to the jury, opening statements are not evidence. They're an opportunity to tell you what the evidence will show. And if the state wants to bring in this evidence, I'm not going to prejudge every little bit of statement that's being made now and rule whether it's relevant or not. We're going to be here for 3 years, not 5 weeks. So it's not a good objection.
I understand, Judge, and
You have a right, but it's not a good objection. I want to note it for the record.